Hi, this is the Voice of Heidie Calero with another economic capsule regarding the Puerto Rico economy. But this time we have broadened the topic because it is a very important topic on interest rates. And as we are recording this economic capsule, Jerome Powell is about to indicate to all the audience and the markets whether he has decided, or the Federal Reserve has decided, not to hike interest rates, at least not in June. And so many analysts are saying that probably this is going to be no increases and that maybe the Federal Reserve might be done. Well, you be the judge of that. Events will let us know whether the Federal Reserve has decided to pause at least for a few months, whether inflation has really receded, whether wage growth is not going ahead of inflation, and whether the U.S. economy is really cooling off. So we have entitled our economic capsule None and Done. No, expect no Fed rate hike now for the month of June. And probably there is a high probability that maybe the Federal Reserve might decide, well, you know, as we look into the data, that maybe the Federal Reserve is done. I doubt it, because they have very ambitious goals as to what inflation should be, like 2%, and we are still far from it. The first graph that I'm depicting for you are these hikes, which have been taking place since March of 2022. Every one of those lines indicates hikes which have been increasing. And so as of March 16 of 2022, the first hike was 0.5%, and then it continued 1% and 1.8%. It continued escalating even higher up to about 4.8%, which was somewhere in the region of November, December of 2022, and thereafter we have been seeing less increases. And so what you're seeing there is that the Federal Reserve is now 5.3%, which is only 0.3% higher than it was before. So it seems to be that rate hike seems to be cooling off. Well, why? What is the Federal Reserve looking at or considering when thinking about increasing interest rates? Well, it's this next graph. It's core inflation versus what is the urban consumer price index, the overall inflation. So they look at these two metrics. Core inflation is the same as the CPI urban, which is really that yellow line that you see there, except that the other one, the core inflation, excludes food prices and energy. So if you see that the core inflation is not really reducing or falling at the same pace as maybe the consumer price index, the overall consumer price index, well, that is an area of concern. And as you can tell there, yes, we were at the peak with the urban CPI 9.1%, somewhere in the region of June of 2022. Well, right now, as of May 2023, it had gone down to 4%. So 5% lower, 5.1% lower. Now, core inflation at its peak, which was a little bit later, somewhere in the region of June, July of 2022, is 6.6%. And that is the blue line that you see there. And at its peak was 6.6%, and now it's about 4%. So the difference between the peak of the core inflation and what it is now, it's 2.6%, which has been falling. But the overall consumer price index has fallen further, almost 5.1%. So that's what the Federal Reserve is considering. Core inflation, yes, it is also declining, still growing, but at a declining rate, but not as fast as the overall urban or CPI. And I'm using the statistics of the US because it's the Federal Reserve that is overall arching the policy of Federal Reserve, of the monetary policy. And what we are seeing is this interest rates hike, which may be reducing or falling. Well, let's look at the other consideration. We've already seen inflation, the CPI, and the core inflation. Let's look at wage growth. And this next graph depicts for you wage growth, which is that green line that you see there from January of 2019 through May of 2023. And that's the green line, which says that maybe somewhere in the region of around the end of December 2019 or November of 2019, the wage growth was 8.1%. That's the hourly wage growth in the States, and it was 8.1%. Notice where inflation was, which is the urban CPI urban, and that inflation was much lower. It was somewhere in the region maybe of a low 0.3%. So big differential. In real terms, wages were rising substantially more than inflation, because this is in nominal terms, the 8.1%, but inflation was scarcely 0.3%. Remember, this is just the prelude of the COVID-19 in 2020, and that gap continued. Yes, wages were growing, as you can see there in that graph, but there was a crossover somewhere in the region of June of 2021. Now the inflation carried forward. Wages, yes, continued increasing, but not at the same pace. So there was this inverted curve that you see there, where the yellow line, which is the inflation rate in the US, was higher than the wage growth. And it is true, we have, after the COVID-19, we have this change in the labor market. And even though they're still looking for employees, it seems that inflation has been overtaking those wage gains that they have been having. And what we see there as of May 2023 is that the urban CPI, the inflation, overall inflation, was 4%, and the wage growth was 3.6%. So different. Still, we didn't have as much in terms of real growth in wages. The next graph depicts for you, well, what does that entail for me, John Doe, you who are listening to me? Well, those interest rates really have an impact on two major things: consumption goods such as cars, and housing, which are durable goods. This next graph depicts what is happening with mortgage rates and housing units in Puerto Rico, total housing units being sold existing or new housing units, which are all the bars that you see there in this graph. And the mortgage rate, even though it is not exactly the same mortgage rate that we follow in Puerto Rico, because there are some differences, but the trend is there. So you can see that the mortgage rate has been rising, and also the Fed funds rate, which they are correlated. Fed funds rate rise, mortgage rates also rise, and so on, all the rates of interest, credit cards, car loans, as we see there. So as long as those interest rates are rising, notice what happens to the sale of those existing units. Yes, there are many other factors here, income, whether there are new construction, but it is really eloquent to see this relationship between mortgage rates and the sale of housing units in Puerto Rico. And then this last graph is another durable consumption, cars. And this is units of cars sold, new cars, which are the columns that you see there. And then that magenta line is the car sales rate in the US, again, only to show and depict the trend. As long as those car sales are now reducing in terms of its growth, is because interest rates are rising, as you see there. It was like 6.58% as of April of 2023, compared with a low of 4.22 somewhere in the region of the end of 2020. And the sale of cars in terms of new units, from a high of 13 10,983 new units. It's now down to 10,870. So yes, there is an interrelationship between interest rates and consumption goods, and that's where you have to be very careful in terms of your budget, in terms of your credit cards. Look for those credit cards that will either give you cash, or they are not in that modest 27 or 28%, as many of these credit cards are, because they move with the Fed funds rate, all the spiral that goes on with all the rates. If you liked our economic capsule, don't forget to subscribe to the Voice of Heidie Calero. Give us a like in those capsules that you really enjoyed, and suggest topics that we might be including in future economic capsules. Don't forget that this is a service of Puerto Rico Economic Pulse, and that the economy is all of us. Thank you.